Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. So we got cool stuff to talk about today. Yesterday, we were talking about how the Republicans and Democrats got formed. A little quick history lesson on that. So in this unit on political parties and elections and voting, we need to talk about third parties in America. Basically, how it's designed for them not to be effective. And we're going to talk in detail about third parties, why kind of the system is set up against them in the United States, and how they're relatively ineffective. Now, the reason that I bring that up and I seem real negative here at the start towards third parties is because third parties actually play a very important role in the United States, in the history of our politics and elections, even though they don't win a lot. So today, before we really get into the nitty-gritty of how the whole system's set up against third parties, because it seems very much like a downer when you talk about third parties and how they just can't win in America because of the way the system is set up, I think it's important to talk first about some of the most important times in American history in which third parties have catastrophically, I don't know if catastrophically, very importantly and effectively affected the outcome of presidential and national elections, because that's where third parties really struggle, because as we talked about yesterday, the Republicans and Democrats are the two main political parties, and they're basically going to have a stranglehold on the presidency and federal politics from the time that the Republicans come out in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, and it's Republicans and Democrats from that point on. So today I want to talk about really what third parties are, what that even means, and give you a couple of examples of the most influential third parties. And then in future lessons, I want to go through and talk about why most third parties don't even get off the ground. But I want to give some clout to third parties today, because they really do, in certain environments, make a massive impact in federal elections. And that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so let's go through some basics here of what is a third party. Well, you probably could figure it out from the name. This is the third one. We're a two-party system in America, Republicans and Democrats. Not that that's in the Constitution. It's not like it's required that way. It's just over time developed into that, and we're going to talk about that in detail. So what is a third party? Well, a third party is a party other than the two major political parties. So there can be a bunch of third parties. They're not like a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh party. Anything that is not a Republican or Democrat, but is a political party, is considered a third party in national politics. No third party has ever gained the White House, but that doesn't mean they're not incredibly important, and I want to give them some credit today as we go through and really talk about them. So they really influence policy on issues. And before I jump in and make it too complicated, let's start with this, because while this is a joke, all right, you have the donkey as a Democratic Party. Talked about Andrew Jackson yesterday and how that symbol has stuck with him and the Democratic Party up to present day. Here in the middle, you got the elephant, which is a good reference for today as well, and a refresher on this. The reason the Grand Old Party or the GOP, the Republicans. I'm not going to add more vocab words here in an intro survey course. The Republicans, their symbol is the elephant. And the reason that is after Abraham Lincoln, for the next rest of the 1800s, the Republicans have a stranglehold on basically any elected office federally. So basically any federal office in the national government, really from the 1860s up to 1900, is going to be Republican. And they had such a massive amount of voters that when they were drawn in cartoons to symbolize the Republican voters, it was like elephant, because they're so big as far as such a huge voting group, and that symbol has stuck with them. So the Republicans are the elephant. And then the unicorn is the third party, because the unicorn isn't a real animal. I'm sorry if I really ruined you guys. Now, granted, when I say the unicorn isn't a real animal, somebody's going to argue with me over that, because people argue that the Earth is flat now. In the 21st century, it's not. I know it has nothing to do with this course. The Earth is not flat. It's not. Not everything is a hoax. But there is no unicorns. All right. As I say this, they're going to find one, and then I'm going to look dumb. Anywho, so yeah, they have the symbol as a unicorn for a third party. That's not actually a symbol for any third party, but they kind of symbolic that that's probably the most appropriate animal for the third parties because they're mystical as far as actually winning. So a third party could be anything. A candidate who represents a third party, right, is outside of the Republicans or Democrats. That's what a third party is. Now, we do have some existing third parties in the United States that do have a pretty good following. They have not ever won federal, like presidential elections, sometimes seats in House of Representatives and the Senate and stuff like that, but it's still a rarity. The two most common in America that we'll come back to these in a later time. Present day are the libertarians. Libertarian third party is basically like government leave us alone. Period. I mean, it's like this as it means liberty. Like the libertarians just mean like less laws, less rules, less taxes, less everything. Even though the United States government provides benefits, the libertarians are like we would rather go without those benefits and then not have taxes and privacy issues and stuff like that. So the libertarians are like just, you know, they're not anarchists. I shouldn't paint them in that picture. But libertarians want smaller government, least invasive government, less involvement in your life as libertarians. The Green Party, and this one has been around for a while. I would imagine they're not going to go away, mainly because the Green Party, think green, is the environment. The Green Party main focus is on environmental stuff, and sometimes third parties can have specific goals in mind, like single issues, and the Green Party in large part is focused on environment, but since everything we do in society really affects the environment, they're not necessarily categorized as a single issue third party. But those are the two political parties that have two third parties that have the largest following in the United States, but it's still microscopic compared to the following Republicans and Democrats have. So why is it so hard for a third party candidate to get elected at the national level? Well, the whole system's really set up against them. And we're going to talk about that more in the future, but people usually are either Republicans or Democrats. And not only that, at the national level, it means the whole country is voting, especially on something like the presidency. Third parties might be popular in certain areas of the country, but they're not generally popular across the whole country because they're so small, they don't have the same outreach that the Republicans or Democrats do that are set up in every state and every county in the United States. So it's just name recognition. It is their policies are usually pretty specific, and the Republicans and Democrats really try to have been around longer. They're more established. They have the rules set up for them. All of that really makes it nearly impossible for a third party in this exact moment that I'm recording this to become the president. That would be a very, very difficult feat. So that's the question. Why is it so extremely difficult for a third party candidate to get elected at a national level? We just talked about that. Pause me, answer that, and we'll move on. All right. So I want to give you a couple examples today before we go through and talk about how the third parties can't win, which I've already been doing. Talk about some times when they really shaped the United States. Before we get into our future lessons, we're really getting the nitty gritty and basically some of the legal reasons why third parties are kind of designed to be unsuccessful. Shocker, by the Republicans and Democrats who don't want the competition. Anyway, so here's the situation. We're going to go in the late 1800s, all right? There is a political party that's going to come out called the Populist. Now, sometimes, and this is common in history, the name of political parties are a common term that gets confused. So populist means like the people. That's what it means. So it's like the populist vote or the popular vote is like the vote of the people. So this group is going to call themselves the Populist Party. Now, the Populist Party is pretty much going to be a single issue political party. But this political issue they have is pretty intense, all right? So see if I can give you enough backstory here without making this overly complicated to lead up to them. A civil war happened. The government in the United States needed a bunch of money in the Civil War. So what they had done is they just printed off a whole bunch of extra money, like, hey, we have extra money. In economics, we'll talk about how that's completely ineffective. It basically makes all the money worthless because it's not actually based on anything. Anywho, so the money basically became worthless. So it's the late 1800s, and the government is thinking about going back to the gold standard. Instead of basing money off of, hopes and dreams, they're going to base it on money so that money has some value. This seems like a good idea at first. The problem is that when you increase the value of the money, that's something called deflation. And long story super short, so you stay with me on this because it would take me a while to explain it. If you base money off gold, it makes the value of the dollar go up, which is actually really bad for poor people because they don't have any dollars, and now it's harder to get dollars. It's the simplest way I can explain it without getting into inflation, deflation, and so if you base money on gold, basing on gold standard, it's bad for poor people. That's the main thing you got to know here. The vast majority of the American population is poor. They're in debt, and it's really bad for people in debt. Deflation is really bad for people in debt because it's harder to pay off their debt. Anyway, however, Republicans and Democrats at the time, the people that are in the national government, they're all rich. So they're like, sure, we'll do gold standard, whatever. Well, there's this huge movement by the average people in America called the Populist Movement, and they're like, no, you're not. All right. Now keep in mind, Republicans have absolutely dominated national politics at this point for like almost 40 years. We're in 1896. So really since 1860, Republicans have just dominated national politics. The Populist Movement is so angry that nobody is listening to them that they create their own political party. All right. Called the Populist Movement. It is a third party, and it is a large one. Their kind of spokesperson is going to end up being William Jennings Bryan. All right, William Jennings Bryan is a preacher, and he gives a very famous speech called his Cross of Gold speech. It says, "You will not crucify us," meaning us, the poor people, "on this cross of gold," using religious symbolism because he's a pastor about to be in the cross. Basically saying, if we go to the gold standard, you're going to kill all these poor people because they can't afford anything. So William Jennings Bryan and the Populists become so popular, little play on words there, that the Democrats are like, oh, let's team up with them because the Democrats have been getting destroyed. So in 1896, the Democrats, they nominate William Jennings Bryan, the leader of the Populist Party, the third party, as the actual Democrat. So that they say, all right, these guys got a good idea, a lot of following. So they nominate William Jennings Bryan to run for president in 1896. This is the election in 1896. They lose. So even though it's like it's a third party and then they join the Democrats, they still lose. But without going into all the previous elections, usually it's an absolute massacre when it comes to Republicans beating the Democrats. They actually barely win. I mean, look at the blue states here. These are all the populists that voted for William Jennings Bryan. All right. After this happens, and this is where it's really important, here's the influence of third parties. Because you're like, Mr. Wagstaff, if you said it's going to be influence, they just lose an election. Absolutely. You know who's really nervous about this map right here after the election is the Republicans. Even though they won, they barely won. And they're like, okay, this isn't good. What happened? And they're like, yeah, so all the poors, the rich people talking to each other, the poors all showed up and voted Democrat because they don't want money based on gold. And the Republicans was like, that's it? And they're like, that's it. Guess what the Republicans do? Even though the Republicans themselves want to base it on gold so they can stay in power, we never base money on gold. It never happens. And the next election, the Republicans win huge again in 1900. Third party candidates, even though the populists go through and they lose, because it showed how motivated the people can be, it scared the actual winning party that didn't get voted for, all right, by the poor people, to change their policies to win more elections. So third parties, and the Populist Party is a great example of that. very effectively influenced federal policy just by voting and having a third party. If the Populist Party had not come out, we absolutely would have gone back to the gold standard, which, woulda, shoulda, coulda is what would have happened. That's a whole nother, really a whole nother course of what if class. So the question is, what was the main issue of the Populist Party, and how did they still help shape America even though they never won? All right. So answer that question completely. Pause me if you need to, and we're moving on. All right. So while the Populist Party is incredibly influential, you're still like, well, Mr. Wagstaff, when they voted, it still came down to two parties, Republicans and Democrats. So I want to tell you, and this is one of my most favorite stories in all of U.S. history. I love this story, and so I teach this a lot in detail in U.S. history. So I'm going to try to hit, without taking a whole hour of class, which I'm not. Let me hit the high points of this story, which is awesome, which is also the story of the most effective third party in American history since Abraham Lincoln came in as a Republican. All right. So, and it has to do with the Republicans splitting. So let me go through and tell you a story. You'll like this. All right. I'll try to simplify this, move quickly while telling you a very streamlined story, assuming you've never heard any of this before. All right. So I'm going to try not to lose anybody here. So in 1898, we fight a war. America does. All right. Against Spain, but we actually fight in Cuba and the Philippines, but in Cuba. The war hero that is going to come out of that war is a man named Theodore Roosevelt. All right, Theodore Roosevelt is a very larger-than-life personality. All right, and he is the war hero that he comes out. Well, the Republicans still at this point have an absolute stranglehold. It's 1898. All right, so this is actually just a couple years after the election we just talked about. This is 1898. So the president at the time is a dude named William McKinley. He's a Republican. One of the reasons the Republicans have all the power is because the super rich people at the time, whole thing called robber barons, guys are like insanely rich. They basically run the United States at the time because they basically throw money at whoever they want to be the president, and that person will become the president because they have unlimited money. So they had basically handpicked this dude, William McKinley, to be the president. Basically, if you can pick your president, they're not going to mess with you. Anywho, so William McKinley is the president, and they see this new guy, Roosevelt, is now a national hero. This concerns the Republicans because Roosevelt has no political affiliation. If Roosevelt, who everybody in America loves because he's a war hero, runs for president, this could challenge the Republicans, and they don't want that. So, very smart, what they decide to do is the next election in 1900, 2 years later, while Roosevelt is super popular, they pick him to be the vice president. They know nothing about this guy's politics. He's a very strong, opinionated person, but William McKinley picks Roosevelt to be his vice president. You know how much power the vice president has? Really none. He just kind of hangs out, breaks ties in the Senate. That's pretty much the power that the vice president has. So all the Republicans were like, whew, dodge that bullet because we can basically make him vice president and he can't do anything. Well, when does the vice president get power? Well, if something happens to the president. In 1901, William McKinley gets shot and killed at the World's Fair in New York. When William McKinley gets shot and killed by a crazy person, all right, guess who becomes the president? Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt becomes the president. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a Republican. He is similar to Andrew Jackson in the way that he has this unbelievable mandate. He has this overwhelming support by the American people, and he just does what he believes is right. He starts conservation stuff. He busts up trust. He actually does a lot of the stuff that the Republicans don't like the rich Republicans. He basically attacks the people who typically fund the Republicans because he's going to do what he believes is right for America and forget about all this political party of what I'm supposed to do. He has overwhelming support by the American people. So Roosevelt is very popular in America. He runs for re-election in 1904. He wins it. So from 1904 to 1908, he's the president. So this is a photograph of Theodore Roosevelt here on the left On the right is one of his best friends, who is his Secretary of War. They become friends once he becomes the Secretary of War, a guy named William Taft. All right, so Taft is Roosevelt's like best friend. The Republicans, while they are happy that they have a Republican in office, they have no control over Roosevelt. Roosevelt's just going to do whatever he wants to do, and it really, really concerns them. But hey, after 1908, he promised he wouldn't run again. So in 1908, Roosevelt, true to his word, said he wouldn't run for a third term. He asked his best friend, William Taft, to be the president in his place. Taft is reluctant. It's a whole story here. Is reluctant to do it, but does. He comes in and is the president. Taft, while is a good human being and ends up being a Supreme Court justice and has a quality career, his time as the president did not go well. He has this concept of dollar diplomacy with other countries. This is literally how the History Channel presents his concept of dollar diplomacy. It's how dollar diplomacy failed. He's not very effective as a president. He's just not. So what ends up really hurting his feelings is Roosevelt turns against him. Roosevelt's like, Taft is awful. He's all. It says he has the brain power of 3 guinea pigs. Like, this hurts Taft's feelings. Taft and they were friends, but Roosevelt completely turns on him. All right, and it's a huge bummer to Taft. This is his best friend that's turned on. So there's all this animosity. So in 1912, all right, so Taft has now been president for 4 years. Roosevelt's in the back chirping at him. Roosevelt's not the president anymore. In 1912, Roosevelt's like, you know what? This was a trash idea, me not to be the president. I'm going to be the president again. And Roosevelt goes to the Republicans and says, I'll be your president again. Now, Roosevelt's a very good president. He got things done. People love him. But the Republicans, they actually don't have any control over Roosevelt, where they have control over Taft. So even though Taft is a less effective president than Roosevelt, in 1912, this is so I should point out the joke before I laugh. In 1912, the Republicans are going to decide to nominate, and we'll talk about nomination in the primary process in future lessons. They're going to pick Taft as a Republican president nominee and not Roosevelt. This is how much faith the Republicans have in Taft. His campaign slogan is, he's all right. Not even like, vote for this guy. They're like, nah, it's all right. Because keep in mind, the Republicans don't lose. This is 1912. They haven't lost an election since ever. Since the Republicans have existed and have run somebody for the presidency, they have never lost. Never. So, it doesn't matter who you put out there. Any human being will win this election. How about we get some out here that we can control? We'll just go with Taft. We'll figure it out later. Well, Roosevelt will not go quietly into the night. Roosevelt creates his own political party, third party. Keep in mind, he has overwhelming support by the American people. He creates the Bull Moose Party. All right, because he's like, I like mooses. Is more than one moose meese, like goose and geese? It's not. But anyway, so he creates the Bull Moose Party, a political party. All right, he's going to run for president against the Republicans and the Democrats. He'd have a third party candidate, and his motto is a square deal all around. Which in American history, we'll talk more about what that means. But you see the picture here of the donkey and the elephant that are surprised by there's this new bull moose here. So you would think, since I've been talking about how much overwhelming support he has a legit shot. Well, at first, people are so committed to who they want to vote for, Republicans and Democrats, he actually doesn't have a lot of support. That's a very telling sign of how hard it is as a third party to win. This man, who everybody loved, has already been the president, already proven himself that he's an effective president, all right, by the majority of the American population's mind, still is struggling to get support running as a third party because people like to stick with either Republicans or Democrats who they normally vote for. Well, Roosevelt's not going to give up. Roosevelt, right before the election, fantastic story, he's going to stand up and give a huge speech in front of a whole big crowded auditorium to try to gain more support. Roosevelt, all right, stands up he memorizes this big old speech on like 15 pieces of paper, and he folds it up and he puts it in his pocket as he walks out on stage. He goes out on stage to give this big speech. I know he's reading a paper here. He's not when the situation happens. He walks out into an auditorium to give this speech, and this is when stories get good in U.S. history. Crazy person shows up, runs up to the front of the stage, and shoots Theodore Roosevelt in the chest. This is like right before the election, all right? Shoots him in the chest. Everybody dogpiles on this guy, drags him out. He's arrested. Will eventually, faces consequences for this. And everybody looks up on the stage, expect to find like a dead Roosevelt or him crumpled over. And Roosevelt's still standing over there, like he's still standing up. He's a war hero, big tough guy, all right? And he opens up his suit jacket. He is pouring blood and says, "It's going to take more than a bullet to stop a bull moose." Shuts his jacket, continues to give his speech for another hour, pouring blood, goes to the hospital, takes himself to the hospital afterwards, has a bullet taken out of his chest, and still makes his 6:30 dinner reservation where he has gives an interview with a reporter. This man got shot in the chest on stage and didn't stop. You think the American people like him now? Absolutely. He gets huge support. Now, before we move on with the story, let me explain to you why he survived. That paper that he folded all up in his pocket and put in his pocket, the bullet went all the way through those papers and stuck in his chest muscle. It never even made it to his rib cage. This is an X-ray. You can see where the bullet, and they're able to remove it. So he survives. Stitching up. It doesn't do a whole lot of internal damage, even though it bled a whole lot. This is the newspaper at the time. Says Roosevelt just ignores the wound, gunshot wound to the chest. He's good. This is in the bottom here. That is an actual picture that's in the Smithsonian of Roosevelt's shirt he was wearing with a bullet hole and covered in his blood. The American people already loved Roosevelt because he was a war hero. This happens right before the election. And it is so when the election happens, like, is he going to have a shot? No. No, he's not. It's not even close. The yellow states are what Roosevelt wins. Now, here's what's interesting. You know who's going to vote for Roosevelt? Half the Republicans. You know what the other half of the Republicans are going to vote for? Republicans. You know who all the Democrats are going to vote for? The Democrat guy. Because Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate, he is actually going to massively influence this election, and the Republicans, for the first time ever, are going to lose because he made the Republicans party split in half. Half the Republicans voted for him, the other half voted for Taft, but all of the Democrats voted for this guy named Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Woodrow Wilson is going to be the first Democratic president since 1956. Since 1856. All right, so you're like 75 years almost of missing a candidate, or I guess more like 60 years of missing a Democratic candidate because a third party caused them to split their vote. So third parties, very much, and there's some more subtle times that this happens when there's closer elections where a third party influences the outcome of the election. But this is probably the most extreme one. So Roosevelt loses, Taft loses, and the Democrats, all right, the donkeys, they win in 1912. All right. So the question here is, how did Teddy Roosevelt split from the Republican Party actually help the Democrats in the election of 1912? All right. Answer that completely. It's as far as we're going to get today. See you guys tomorrow.